It's an honor to be here and to be surrounded. So if you don't like me, I know I'm a goner because I have no escape routes. It's a very interesting way you have people seated here. I'm here to talk to you about the subject of hope. The actual title is up there, Hope Beyond the Walls of the World and the Purpose of Story. The meaning of the title, I know, will become evident as we go along. I won't describe it right now, but I do want to start talking to you about the idea of hope. I think, in the year 2001, began to understand the psychological and cultural importance of the concept of hope by reading a book that I'd like to recommend to you, especially if you're interested in the history of American culture, but even if you're not interested in American culture but just want to understand how to analyze culture. Andrew Delbanco, who is a very prominent professor of humanities at Columbia University, back around that time wrote a short little book, Harvard University Press, entitled The Real American Dream, A Meditation on Hope. And what he suggests in there is that the best way to understand what a culture is about is by looking to see what the culture says is our hope. And here's what he says. This is from the introduction. He says, the heart of any culture is hope. Hope is the way we overcome the lurking suspicion that all our getting and spending amounts to fidgeting while we wait for death. We must imagine some end to life that transcends our own tiny allotment of days and hours if we are to keep at bay the dim back of the mind suspicion that one may be adrift in an absurd world. Now, let me analyze that extraordinarily helpful couple of sentences. First of all, he says that we have to overcome the nagging suspicion that life is pointless, that nothing we do matters, that nothing we do has any kind of meaning. He says we have the lurking suspicion that all our getting and spending amounts to fidgeting while we wait for death, that nothing we're doing makes any difference. It's all pointless. So you have to overcome that to live life. And cultures tend to collectively do that. He says one of the ways to understand a culture is every culture ordinarily gives an answer to that question. Is life pointless or not? If it's not, why not? And generally it's because they say, this is our hope. This is what makes life meaningful. And what he does is he goes through American culture. I think you might find this interesting. He goes through American culture and he talks about the transitions. He says that 18th century American culture, 19th century American culture, 20th century American culture, what were the hopes? What was the hope of each of those centuries? And he says 18th century, the hope of American culture was God. In the 19th century, the hope of American culture was nation, the nation. And in the 20th century, the hope of American culture was self. Those are the three titles of his three chapters: God, nation, self. It says in every single situation, in every century, what American culture did was it said, here's why life is not pointless. Here's what you should be living for. And every culture, he says, has to answer that question, why life isn't pointless and what we should be living for. And he says you can understand cultures and you can even understand the transitions in cultures by looking at what the collective hope is. Now, he actually, and I'll get back to this in a second, thinks that America's in a cultural crisis right now because the hope that we have right now doesn't create a coherent society, but I'll get back to that later. And besides that, I'm not here to talk about American culture particularly, but about hope in general. So I'd like to tackle this question, this subject this way. I'd like to first of all address the question, what is hope? Then secondly, talk about the problem of hope, that is, the psychological and cultural problems that hope presents to us. And then thirdly, I'd like to talk about several alternative ways of dealing with that problem of hope. And then finally, I'd like to present how Christianity is a resource for us today to deal with the problem of hope. What is hope? What's the problem of hope? What are the different alternatives out there right now for dealing with the problem of hope, and how Christianity can be a great resource for dealing with the problem of hope. Ready? Let's go. Number one, what's hope? I will make this point the shortest so you'll have hope. That somehow the lecture will be bearable. First of all, what's hope? Basically, hope has got two aspects to it: desire and expectation. You've got desires, then you have to have something that you expect will fulfill those desires. And whatever it is that you expect will fulfill those desires is your hope. Our English word, we're here in an English-speaking setting, our English word hope, it does not serve us terribly well. The English word hope has a major, the lexical range of the English word hope has an awful lot of ambiguity in it. So when we say, are you sure about something? There's a tendency for us to say, well, I'm not sure, I hope so, but I'm not sure. And so the word hope actually means uncertainty in some cases. But actually, if you take a look at in ancient times, the Greek word that's usually translated hope, the Greek word elpis, means strong expectation. The Hebrew word that's translated hope is tikvah, and it actually it comes from a word that means a strong rope, and it again means something that is firm, solid expectation. Traditionally, your hope is that which you expect and that you are sure will satisfy your deepest desires. That's it. So hope has two aspects to it: desires, expectation. You have strong desires, deep desires. Whatever you expect will satisfy those deepest desires of your heart. That's your hope. And under this heading of what is hope, let's just talk for a second about the importance of it. I want you to see the importance of hope. Imagine two people who are given exactly the same job. The first person is put into this room, second person is put into this room. The rooms are identical, same lighting, same temperature, same conditions. And each person is given the very same task, to screw part A onto part B, let's say. And that's what they do for 8-10 hours a day. So they're in the same situation, they're given the very same task, they're in the same conditions, the circumstances are identical. But you tell person A, your annual income for this job is $1,000. And you tell person B, your annual income for this job is $10 million. Okay. So they're both working. And then they have a break at lunch, and they sit down at break, and the person over here, the person that expects to make $1,000, says, boy, isn't this a terrible job? It's tedious, it's boring. Don't you find it hard to do? And the person over here says, no, I don't find it tedious. Actually, I'm looking forward to the year. I mean, there's no problem. Well, how can you? Well, here's the difference. These two people are in identical circumstances, and yet they're experiencing their identical circumstances in radically different ways because of their expectation, because their hopes are different, because their expectation of what's going to be the result of all this work are utterly different. And because their hopes are different, they experience their circumstances differently. Or put another way, their beliefs about the future radically and completely determine how they experience the present. We are unavoidably, radically hope-oriented creatures. We are radically, I don't know how to put it, hope-based creatures. And so don't tell yourself that your hopes don't matter that much, or what you think is going to happen in the future. Or frankly, what you think happens after you die, which is your ultimate future. What you think happens what you think life is about. In other words, whatever you think your future is will radically determine your present. So that's what hope is. It's your expectations of what is going to satisfy your deepest desires. It's a future orientation. It's extremely important. That's what hope is. Now, secondly, I'd like to talk to you about the problem of hope, and particularly how today hope is both a cultural and psychological problem. I'm going to mention cultural now, and I'll probably mention it later, but I'm not going to spend most of my time on this aspect of it. Why? Because I've only got so much time, and I thought a lot of you would probably find the psychological part more interesting. But the cultural problem is brought out by Andrew Delbanco, the Professor Delbanco. He actually points out that the main hope that American culture holds out now for people is you need to decide what will be a fulfilling life for you. What matters is not our nation, not our people, not our God. What matters is that you're happy, and that you're having a happy, fulfilled life. That you are realizing the self, and you're becoming the self you want to be. And Delbanco makes a very, very, very powerful case that a society can't be based on something like that. It doesn't cohere. That's not a principle for a cohesive society. And it was actually in the little snippet I read you. Remember what he said? He said, we must imagine some end to life that transcends our own tiny allotment of days and hours if we were to keep at bay the dim back of the mind suspicion that one may be adrift in an absurd world. And what he's saying is there's got to be something more important than me, something that transcends me, for me to live for, that binds together a culture. We're not really a culture. We're not really a community of people if everybody's out for him or herself. There's got to be something more important than our happiness in order to create a culture. And he says, well, Americans have lost sight of that. And therefore, hope is a cultural problem. And cultures today are trying to find hopes that will unite people into a coherent community, a human community. But as powerful a question as that is, and as big a question as that is, I'd like to point out also that hope poses a major psychological problem. And here's what I mean by that. I don't believe today, and especially I'm talking to a lot of young people, not all of you, some of you look like you've got my hairline, but by and large, I'm looking at younger people. And I know I've got a tough audience because I don't believe young people realize until later on the degree to which they are discontent and will be discontent in life. The psychological problem of hope is we have deep desires. We all decide to set our expectations on something that we think will satisfy those desires. And those things are our hopes. As time goes on, you come to realize the psychological problem, and that is that nothing satisfies our deepest desires. That our hopes are actually they always fail us. And that our deepest desires are insatiable, they're inconsolable. Another way to say it is they're indelible. There's just nothing that seems to satisfy them. And we're going to talk for the next few minutes about the fact that is a huge psychological problem. We do not want to admit that. We don't want to admit the level of our discontent. Here's some interesting just quotes that get at that. Horace, ancient Roman poet, says, "No one lives content." Well, that settles it. Horace said so. But let's move on. A modern American poet and writer, author, Wallace Stevens, wrote this. He says, "In contentment, I still feel the need of some imperishable bliss." Even in contentment, I still feel the need of some imperishable bliss. And what he's saying, I think, is even when I feel content, I know I'm not really content because I know that this is temporary. Whenever I feel content, I immediately sense the disappointment in the middle of my contentment because I know I will not be able to hold on to this, and I want to. So immediately it starts to turn to ashes. Even in contentment, I still feel the need of some imperishable bliss. Henrik Ibsen, the great Norwegian playwright, put it like this. He says, "When you take away the life lie of anyone, they lose all their happiness." Now, what's the life lie? If you read what Ibsen says, the life lie is that anything will make you happy. The life lie is, if I just find Mr. Right or Ms. Right, if I just get to this level of success so I can have the home of my dreams, if I could write the novel I want to write. In other words, if I just get here, then I'll be happy. And Heinrich Ibsen says, that's a life lie. Because basically what happens is you spend most of your life going through life, getting to many of the things that we think will make us happy, finding it doesn't. And then it destroys all our happiness. When I first came to New York City years ago, I used to read the Village Voice. It was a kind of downtown avant-garde rag. And there was a woman who wrote in the Village Voice. Her name was Cynthia Heimel. Cynthia Heimel wrote a book. She wrote a column, I think it was called Tongue in Cheek, C-H-I-C, Tongue in Cheek. And one time she wrote a column about how many people that she had known. If you live in New York for a long time, you always meet a bunch of people some of whom make good. So, and she made a list of 5 or 6 people that she knew I won't even use the names just because what she says about them is a little on the nasty side. But she knew them. These were people who eventually became big movie stars. But she remembered so-and-so when she was working behind the cosmetic counter at Macy's. Or she knew so-and-so when he was just a bouncer for a club, and then he became this big name. So she knew 5 or 6 people who had become huge movie stars, but before that, they had just been, people who were scrambling, waiters and waitresses and working jobs and so forth. And this is what she said about them. She saw them get famous. She saw them become successful. And then she also saw how unhappy they were. And this is what she wrote. She says, that giant thing they were all striving for, that fame thing that was going to make everything okay, that was going to make their lives bearable, that was going to provide them with personal fulfillment and happiness. It had happened, and nothing changed. They were still them. The disillusionment turned them howling and insufferable. And then she says, and she's not a Christian believer, by the way, in any way, then she said this, I think if God really wants to play the most rotten practical joke on us, he grants you your deepest wish and then giggles merrily as you suddenly realize you want to kill yourself. A very irreverent thing to say. I'm a Christian minister. I couldn't say it. But I read you the quote because she said it and I wanted you to hear it. She says, the worst thing that anybody could possibly do to you is to grant your deepest wish. And then a couple weeks later, watch you try to kill yourself. You think that's trumped up? Listen, I can't tell you how many people, young people in New York City that I have read this passage to over the years who said, it won't be different with me. Oh, yeah. It will not be different with you. If you really knew that, the whole course of your life would be changed right now. You probably don't. I hope that some of you will remember this lecture in some vague way 5 or 10 or 15 years from now and say, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. Now, nobody put this better. Now, you see, here's what is the psychological problem? Let's recount it. I'm going to give you some more quotes. The psychological problem is your desires are deeper than you think. Your desires for love, your desires for acceptance, there's all sorts of ways of describing them. Desires for success, desires to achieve, find your place in life, figure out who you are. We have all kinds of modern ways of talking about what we're looking for. Those desires are deeper than you think, because when you get out in life, you're going to discover that the things you think, that you expect, that you hope in, that you think are going to fulfill or satisfy them will not. And then you're going to discover that my desires are inconsolable, they're insatiable, and therefore hope always disappoints me. C.S. Lewis was an Oxford professor who did a series of radio talks over the BBC during World War II, in which he was trying to basically just present Christianity in a relatively popular and accessible form. And he has one chapter in that book, that became a book. The radio talks were put out in a classic book called Mere Christianity. And there is a chapter in that book, there's one of those talks called Hope. Hope. And in it he says this, and I don't think there's any better way to put it. He says, most people, if they really learned how to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. Now, there are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never keep their promise. The longings which arise in us when we first fall in love, or first think of some foreign country, or first take up some subject that excites us, or longings which no marriage, no travel, no learning can really satisfy. I am not speaking of what ordinarily would be called unsuccessful marriages or trips and so on. I am speaking even of the best possible ones. There's always something we grasped at in that first moment of longing that just fades away in the reality. The spouse may have been a good spouse. The scenery has been excellent. It has turned out to be a very good job, but it has evaded us. It. What's he talking about? The satisfaction of our longings. We get married and it has evaded us. Good spouse, but it's not giving me the satisfaction I want. We get into the career we want and it has evaded us. So this is the psychological problem as well as the cultural problem of hope. Big problem. Now, question, how do people try to solve this problem? And I'd like to give you a whole slew of alternatives. There's so many of them that I'm categorizing. I'm going to give them to you under 4 categories. Ready? These are 4 categories of alternate ways that people try to deal with the problem of hope. Category A are people who think it, that is satisfaction of your deepest desires, it is still out there in things. What do I mean by things? Well, love, romance, family, money, success, achievement, pleasure, political causes. It is still out there if I can just find the right thing. That's category A. Now, there's 2 kinds of people in category A. Many of them are in this room because you're young. Most young people know that they're not that satisfied, but they're so sure that they will be satisfied later on because they'll get it, because they'll get the things that they're after. That's why they're here at the university, getting myself in a position where I can get these things, and you've decided what things you want. Most of you know you're pretty unsatisfied right now, but you're sure that that's okay because eventually you will be. And so younger people are dismissive of this whole problem. They doubt it's a big problem. And even though you're actually pretty unhappy in life, the reason why you're not completely dysfunctional is because you tell yourself, I will be happy later. So that's how you live. You're actually very unhappy. You don't know who you are. You often get down. You often feel kind of depressed. But you say, hey, I'm just a student and I'm getting it together, and if I do it. So you have hopes of the future, generic hopes of the future. And actually, an awful lot of young people today believe that if they're just fairly successful and they find a love partner and they learn some meditation techniques to relax themselves, that they'll be fine. That's what you want. In other words, some success, some love, some meditation, I'll be fine. You do not know how deep your desires are. You just don't know. You don't understand the psychological problem of hope yet. Okay. Then there's another kind of person in category A. Category A is it is still out there in things. The satisfaction is out there in things. The second kind, and this is a sad kind of person, these are people my age, or something like my age, who just never got to their goals. They never got married, and they wanted to be married, or they never even got close to the level of success they wanted in their career, or they never got into the career they wanted. And there's a lot of people who were sure that it is in ABC. Now, if you're young, you're sure it is in ABC, and you're going to get there someday. So you just sort of put the whole hope thing off. But there's a lot of people my age who missed ABC, never got to ABC, and know they'll never get to ABC now. But because they never got there, they still live under the illusion that if they did get there, they'd be happy. Now, these kinds of folks are very often very bitter. Actually, this sounds very weird, but a lot of good social activism happens because very often, if you're trying to get to ABC and you don't get there and you perceive that it's some social group that did it, that some racism or some injustice kept you from getting ABC, very often you get very upset and then you become a social activist. You want to change things. And a lot of good work happens that way. But sometimes it's based on the illusion that if I got into ABC, I would have found it. So people who think that ABC, it's in there, younger or older, are folks that are still living in an illusion. And the people who are older who feel like I've failed and I'll never get ABC, they can be extremely bitter, very upset. We're filled with self-hate, filled with a sense of failure. I never got ABC. The reason I'm unhappy is I failed, and you get down on yourself. So that's category A. Not a good category to be in, at least not for long. Category B, now these are people like the Cynthia Heimel was describing. These are people who got the things they thought it was in, and it wasn't in the things. They got the things, and it wasn't in them. Now, there's at least 4 ways of responding to that. First of all is what C.S. Lewis, now C.S. Lewis speaks a little bit about some of this in his BBC radio talk and his book. One is there are some people in this category that they get successful, they find they're unhappy, and they're sure that the real problem was, I guess I need to get another set of things. So I got married, I'm not nearly as satisfied as I thought, so I need another spouse. I got this great career, and I made this amount of money, and I'm still not all that satisfied, so I probably need to make twice as much money. C.S. Lewis calls these the fools. He says they're fools because they're really they're quite a nuisance to most people. He says an awful lot of bored celebrities and wealthy people are like this. And that is, they got everything they thought would make them happy, they're unhappy, so they just keep discarding the old things and trying to find the new things. If I just get the right new things, then I'll get it. He calls those the fools. There's a second group of people who get successful and find that they're unsatisfied, and I call them the spiritualizing group. They decided that their mistake was they thought that they were going to find it in material things, like money, sex, and power. And instead they decide, I'm going to find my satisfaction in more spiritual things, so I'm going to work for a better world, or I'm going to work for social justice, or I'm going to help the poor, or I'm going to work on meditation. We're going to get to that in a minute. There's some people who say, well, my problem was I thought success was everything, and so I'm just going to become a better person. I'm going to start helping people. I'm going to start doing all these things. By the way, that will not make you, frankly, all that happy either. It's hard work to do that. It's very draining to do that. It is not satisfying to do that. A third kind of person who gets success, finds that it hasn't satisfied them. They are the despairing people. They're the people that kill themselves, or hurt themselves, or cut themselves. Quite a few people who think that they're going to find it in things, and they find it, got the things that thought it was in, and they don't find it there. Some of them just give up. But lastly, under this category, this is where most people, I think, go. In a place like New York City, where a lot of people have been successful and they find that they haven't found that satisfaction, what they do is they harden themselves. What they do is they say, there is no it. And these deep desires of mine are just illusions. They're just illusions. I think C.S. Lewis actually describes this kind of person in his radio talk, and I think he says something like this, if I remember correctly. Yeah, he says this. This is the self-talk of a person like this. Well, of course, one feels like that when one is young. But by the time you get to my age, you've given up chasing the rainbow's end. And Lewis says, so this kind of person settles down, learns not to expect much out of life, and represses the part of himself that used to, as he would say, cry for the moon. Now, on the one hand, a person like that becomes very condescending. On the other hand, a person like that becomes very hard. See, if you decide, look, I wanted so much out of life, but I was crying for the moon. I'm wiser now. I'm more sophisticated now. Romance never gives you much. Money never gives you much. Everybody's on the take. Nothing really satisfies. So you harden yourself, and you say, you become cynical, and you become sophisticated, and to a degree it works. But there's two things that really, really are bad about that. One is you become a remarkable snob. You're so self-righteous toward anybody who still thinks life has meaning. You look down your nose at them. You know, you become a stuck-up prig. But here's the other thing, which is even worse. You are hardening part of your heart that makes you human. To long for love, to long for meaning, to long for satisfaction and fulfillment is part of what makes you human. And by repressing that part, by rolling your eyes at everybody who's idealistic, you've actually hurt yourself pretty badly. You've actually destroyed part of what makes you a human being and not an animal. Animals just operate on instinct. Human beings have aspirations. Now, category C, story. Story. One of the ways a lot of people deal with the fact that nothing in life really gives them what they're looking for is art. They go to art, they go to story, they go to movies, they go to narrative. And J.R.R. Tolkien, who was one of C.S. Lewis's close friends, who wrote, of course, the famous trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, wrote a very important essay some years ago, obviously, called On Fairy Stories. And in it, he gave a rationale for why he wrote not what he called realistic fiction, which he wasn't against, but he liked fairy stories. He liked epics. He liked myths. He liked even science fiction. And he said that no matter how much we say, oh, if you're a serious, contemporary modern person, you will not want to read fairy stories. Fairy stories, about evil enchantments and princes kissing Sleeping Beauty to awaken her and dragons and knights. Yeah, that's for children. If you're a grown-up person, you read realistic fiction. Tolkien predicted, rightly, that human beings, including adult human beings, would never, ever, ever get past their insatiable desire for fantasy fiction. And here's what he said the reasons were. He says, take a look at fairy tales and science fiction. Here's what you have in them. You have stories in which people escape death, in which they step outside of time, in which they have communication with intelligent beings that are not human, in which they have love that they never, ever lose, love without parting, and in which evil completely is defeated by good. Good triumphs over evil. Now, he says the reason why human beings keep spending billions and trillions of dollars to read or watch or consume stories like that, what we call fairy stories, is because we are endlessly fascinated by these subjects. Even when we know they're fiction, of course, even though we know it's not true, but there's something deeply consoling about a well-told story, realistically depicted, in which people escape death and live forever, or have love without parting, or communicate with non-human beings, or step outside of time. We're just fascinated by it. We have this incredible appetite. Why? Because we want those things. It's the reason why real life will never satisfy us. We're reading those stories, and if they're told well, they still console us, even though it's bittersweet. And it tells you something about the human heart and the human soul. The human heart and the human soul wants those things. And we can't not want those things. Well, that's ridiculous. That's silly. Life is over. When you die, that's the end of it. You can't escape time. You can't have love without parting. Everybody you love, you're going to lose. They're going to go away from you, or something's going to happen, or they're going to die, or you're going to die. This is silly. Why do we keep reading and watching these stories? Tolkien says, because that's what the human heart wants. And realistic fiction cannot scratch that itch. And he actually says, interestingly enough, he says, if fairy stories awaken this deep desire, satisfying it while often whetting it unbearably, they succeed. Did you hear that? He says, when a good fairy story awakens these desires, satisfying them while often whetting them unbearably, they succeed. The stories succeed. So one of the ways I know a lot of people just get by is narrative, story. Real life is just kind of dark. Story makes you feel like maybe life has meaning, maybe there is hope, even though, as far as you know, there isn't. Now, let me just say one quick thing really quickly. There is one more category before going to Christianity, explaining why Christianity is such a great resource. Buddhism. Buddhism is like Christianity in a couple of ways, and I just think this is rather interesting. Buddhism alone, with Christianity, admits that one of the reasons why hope is always making us unsatisfied is that the things of this world cannot satisfy desire. Buddhism says the things of this world can't satisfy desire. As long as we're looking for success or spiritual or material success, in other words, the things of this world cannot satisfy desire. That's the first thing Buddhism says. The second thing Buddhism says, like Christianity, is the only way, therefore, to stop being so dissatisfied is through a spiritual conversion, a change of spiritual consciousness. But the problem here is, I shouldn't say problem, the difference between Buddhism and Christianity is why do hopes disappoint us? Buddhism's answer is this, that we have the illusion that we're an individual self. And the way for us to overcome, the desires we have is because we think we're an individual self. So we need this, and we need this, I need money, I need love, I need these things. To overcome this is you need to overcome the illusion you're an individual self, and you need to see that we're unified with all things. Everything is one. We are that. That is us. And because we are all one, there's really nothing that you need. If you say, oh, I need that, I don't have that, that's not true. That is you. You are that. And so there needs to be, through contemplation, through meditation, you overcome the illusion that you're a person. You're not a person. And Buddhism also says, once you overcome the illusion that you're a person, you're part of this whole, you also then detach. Stop being so attached to this. Stop being so attached to that. You attach your heart to things, and then you lose them, and then you're so unhappy. If you want to overcome this constant unhappiness, detach your heart. Tell yourself everything is yours anyway. You're all part of everything. That eventually the illusion of being an individual self will go away and you will be part of the all-soul. Christianity says, no, that's not our problem. What is our problem? Here's what the problem is. St. Augustine. St. Augustine says that all human beings were made for love. That this desire for love that we never lose is not an illusion. It's not an illusion that comes from the illusion that we're a person. Buddhism would say that it's an illusion that we are persons, and we're not persons, we're part of the whole. Christianity would say absolutely we're persons. You know why? We were created by a tri-personal God. Christianity believes that God is one, but within one God there are three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. What this means is that love has been there from the beginning of the universe. St. Augustine would say and argue that if you had a unipersonal God, not a tri-personal God, not a triune God, but a unipersonal God, love would not have happened until that God created other persons. Why? Because love can only happen between persons, right? You got to have two persons to have love. So if there was a unipersonal God, there would have been power before love. This unipersonal God would have existed without love because there was no other persons. And then when he just created persons, then love was possible. So power comes before love. But if God is triune, if there's three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who have been loving and knowing and communicating with each other from all eternity, and that when they created the world, when God created the world was being created not in order to create love, but to share the love that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit already had. That means love comes before power. That means love is intrinsic to all life. And we were created to love God and to know the same joy that God had within himself. That's what Augustine says. Now, the problem we have today is because of sin, our loves are disordered. And you know what that means? It means we love things more than we love God. And Augustine would say, if you love anything in this life more than you love God, Anything at all. If you love, for example, your spouse more than you love God, your loves are disordered, they're out of order. If you love things third that you should be loving first, if you're loving things first that you should be loving fourth, your loves are out of order. And that's where all the problems come from. So, for example, if I love my wife more than I love God, if her love is more important to me than God's love, then I will either crush her with my expectations, because I'll try to be getting out of her what only God can give me. And if she's imperfect and if she doesn't love me the way I want her to love me, or if she's in a bad mood that day, I crush her with my expectations. On the other hand, she breaks my heart because she never quite lives up to what I need her to be. And therefore, if I love her more than I love God, I will not love her well. I'll be using her. I'll be exploiting her. I'll be basically using her as a way of getting myself happy, feeling good about myself. Do you see? That's just one example. Our problems are, our hearts, St. Augustine says, were made for God, for the love of God, for the significance and the security that comes from a love relationship with God. And if God is not, because we were created for that, and if God is not the center of your life, all of your longings, as they fix themselves on these other things, will always, always, always be disappointed. And this leads now, lastly, here's some Christian resources for hope. 3 things. If you believe what I just said, if you're a Christian, or even if you're not a Christian, please notice 3 ways that Christianity could be a great resource to the cultural and psychological problem of hope. Number 1, if Christianity is true, then your deepest longings are not illusions. See, if we really long for escaping time, if we really long for love without parting, if we long to escape death, both secularism and Buddhism are saying, well, those longings are unrealistic. There is no way to escape death. There is no way to have love that goes on forever. See, the longings are illusions. They're what we call false positives. You know what a false positive is? It's doing a medical test that comes up positive, and yet you don't really have the condition. It's a flaw in the test. And so most people say this longing that we can escape death, this longing for love that would never part, this longing that we could step outside of time, these are false positives. There's no possibility. But here's what Christianity says. If God has come into the world in Jesus Christ, died on the cross for our sins, so that God can come into our life and pardon us and forgive us, and that when we die, we come into God's presence. We live in a love relationship with God forever. We stay ourselves. We stay as persons. We don't become part of an impersonal force. God is personal. We're personal. We stay ourselves. And someday, we get resurrected bodies, and God renews this world, this new heavens and new earth, this material world. That's what the Christian hope is. Now, that means, first of all, that our deepest longings are not false positives. They're not illusions. They're evidences of reality. The reason we want to live forever is we were meant to live forever. The reason we want love without parting is we were meant to have love without parting. The reason we want to escape time is we weren't meant for time. We were meant for eternity. The reason we want to communicate with intelligent non-human beings is there are intelligent non-human beings. C.S. Lewis put it this way at the climax of his great talk on hope. He says, so a duckling wants to swim? Well, there's such a thing as water. A baby wants to suck? There's such a thing as milk. If I find in myself a longing which this world cannot meet, then it probably means that I was made for another world as well. So first of all, the Christian view of hope means that your deep longings are actually not illusions. They're not stupid. They're not things that you have to harden yourself and kill, which means it hurts your humanity. Secondly, Christianity really, really gives you a tremendous answer, I think, to the cultural problem, by the way. See, if you believe that this world is an illusion, or if you even believe this world is going to all that matters is I be successful, why work for a better world? But if you believe that God is going to resurrect this world and make this world a better place in the end, that means there's a reason for you to care about people. If persons are just illusions, Why believe in human rights? But if persons are realities and they're going to live forever because they're made in the image of God, then human rights and human dignity is important. There's all kinds of ways in which Christianity is a solution to our cultural problem. But the most important one for me to press you on right now, it's an answer to the psychological problem. Because basically, the more you find that you can, through faith, have God be someone that in prayer whose love you experience, that begins to heal everything. It begins to heal absolutely everything. The Christian hope is based on this reality, that God is a person and a love relationship with him is possible. And one more thing, and I'm done here. When J.R.R. Tolkien was talking to C.S. Lewis one day in 1920, I think it was, they were both professors at Oxford, and Tolkien was a believer in God, a Christian, and C.S. Lewis was not. He was an atheist. But Lewis did believe what Tolkien believed, and that was that stories, especially the ancient stories, the epics, the fairy stories, that talked about escape from death and talked about stepping outside of time, he understood that there's something deeply consoling about those stories. There was something deep in human beings that longed for this to be true, and that there was nothing more satisfying than these stories. But he was an atheist. And they were walking along, and by the way, the account of this, this conversation is in a number of different books, but I don't have time to give them to you now. They were walking along, and at one point, Lewis says, yes, the old myths and stories are wonderful, but he said to Tolkien, but myths are lies, though breathed through silver. And Tolkien said, no, they're not. Not if Christianity's true. And here's what he said. When you read these old fairy stories about how there is a love without parting, how there is resurrection from the dead, when you read all these old stories, even though you know they're fiction, you feel somehow they're pointing to some kind of truth. Even though they are fiction, you feel somehow they're pointing to some kind of truth about reality. He says, but when you get to the gospel story, the story of Jesus Christ, how God saw us in all of our trouble down here, and in the person of Jesus Christ comes down and writes himself into our story, as it were, to rescue us, dies on the cross, when everything looks terrible, at the last minute, he breaks the power of death, he's resurrected. He says, that is not one more, this is Tolkien saying this to Lewis, he says, that is not one more story pointing to the underlying truth. This is the underlying truth to which all the other stories point. Beauty and the Beast. Somehow there's a love that transforms us out of our self-imposed prisons. Sleeping Beauty, there's a great prince who's going to wake us up from the sleeping death we're in. Peter Pan, we're meant to fly, we're meant to never age. These are stories, right? But if Jesus Christ's story, the gospel story, is true, and I believe it is, then all those things are going to come true for you if you believe in him. That's an incredibly powerful hope. There's one place in a movie, there's an old Steven Spielberg movie that didn't do very well, and a lot of people don't like it. It's called Hook. It's a movie about Robin Williams playing a grown-up Peter Pan who's got amnesia. Remember that? I think he's a hedge fund operator now, anyway. And Wendy is played by Maggie Smith, and she's old, and she remembers the stories. She knows it happened. But Peter Pan, for whatever reasons, got amnesia. I'm not sure. Maybe that's why maybe why the movie didn't work. But I do know there's this one amazing place where Peter's children are being read stories about Peter Pan by Wendy, Maggie Smith. And Peter Pan's getting this kind of strange feeling as he hears the story. And Maggie turns around and Wendy looks and says, Peter, the stories are true. And every time I see that, as a Christian, I get a chill. Because I would like to be able to say to all the people of the world who are reading these stories and listening to these stories, and while the story's on the screen, you feel like there is a meaning in life, there is hope, there is a way of escaping death, and then the movie's over and you walk out and in reality you know that's just not how life is. I want to be able to say to you, if Jesus Christ is raised from the dead, all the stories actually are true. I get this chill when I see that, because I know that in Jesus Christ, hope will not disappoint. Hope beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief.
Is hope real? Because it's still projected into what you would call
beyond
a reality.
the walls of the world, right?
Yeah. So how do we really know that, and how do we know it now? Because do we still feel unsatisfied while we are here on Earth, and then it's only later that it works?
Well, now it went by rather quickly. I'm glad you're asking me the question, because I did speak quickly at the end. It could have been easy to misunderstand. St. Augustine, who I was relying on, in his book Confessions, talks about the fact that you can actually begin to experience this hope now. When the reality of the future becomes, you get assurance of the reality of this future of love in the presence of God through prayer, through ways in which you can encounter God now in your personal experience. Again, this is like Buddhism in a way. Buddhism says you're making a mistake to think that you will find your heart's desires in material things. It also says that you need to have a transformation of consciousness. It's all true. And it's also true that it's in prayer and meditation that this transformation of consciousness comes. And I think that there's an objective side to Christianity. I believe that Christianity is true because of the evidence of the Gospels about the life of Jesus, the evidence for the resurrections. There's an objective side, but I must say that would not be enough to give me the hope to face life if there wasn't an existential subjective appropriation of that hope now to a degree. It's partial. Paul talks about the fact that we see in a mirror darkly. It's his way of saying we don't experience it completely, and it's episodic. But the hope is something that can be experienced now. And thank you for giving me a chance to clarify that.
Now, people are asking because the premise is that God exists for this to work, right?
Well, yes.
And but what if that premise is wrong? I suppose that's the big question for many people.
Well, there's a lot of ways of what I tried to show was that all other things being equal, the Christian approach to hope is, I think, the most satisfying one. And so what I did today is, by putting it up against Buddhism, I think most of us like the idea that we would stay as persons and stay in love relationship forever. I think that is extraordinarily appealing. I do think that it's probably generally more appealing than alternate understandings of eternity. It's certainly more appealing than the idea that when you die you rot, and when the sun goes out, nothing that has been done throughout all the years of human civilization just goes away. So the Christian hope, I think it's easy to see that it's emotionally incredibly satisfying, and culturally satisfying. But now, whether it's rationally true, I didn't go there. You didn't. That was not my topic today.
That's true.
And as it was, I know that it's irritating sometimes for people to hear a lecture on why Christianity is very, very appealing, but doesn't really address the question of whether it's true or not. How do we know it's true? And yet, I guess I would say this: I don't think most people today are motivated to dig into the evidence for Christianity unless they see that if it was true, it would really make a difference for them. And so I wanted people to say, frankly, when I was a college student, and losing being an American, a white American, I was raised in a Lutheran church with a name like Keller, German. But I was pretty much losing in college my sense that Christianity was relevant for me, and losing my sense that it was true. There was plenty of intelligent people that didn't think it was true. I needed to not only see that if it was true, it would be enormously relevant to my psychological and cultural problems. At the same time, I was doing the hard work of figuring out whether it really rationally and logically made sense. I needed to have those things both. It's almost like I found my way into faith with 2 feet, just the way you have to walk left, right, or two wings of the airplane, proverbial. So I only gave you one step, one wing, I admit. But I actually think that today, especially in Western culture, and a place like Hong Kong seems like an interesting intersection of West and East, but certainly in Western culture, Christianity is seen primarily as useless and untrue, but it's also useless. And unless we see why that's just not true, it's not useless, it's enormously appealing and has tremendous resources to help us deal with our psychological and cultural problems, then you're not going to go to the extra hard work of that. But, you know, you could always perhaps have me back, and I could try that one.
Oh, you're very welcome.
I know, it's not a promise.
Sure.
It's not a promise.
Yeah. I mean, there are, I guess what you're saying, because there are questions about this, is that if the story that you're saying seems to make sense, we should look for the reasons why it makes sense. Because I think people are asking, well, why do I believe in a story?
Yeah, well, you know, G.K. Chesterton has his famous book, Orthodoxy. He's got a, oh dear, I don't remember what chapter it's in. I think it's called, oh my goodness. Anyway, in one of his chapters, he talks about if you found a key, you would assume that there was a lock someplace. He's trying to say that when you see a story that makes such profound sense to your heart, it is at least a bit of evidence. In fact, Lewis tried to say, ducklings want to swim, there's such a thing as water. Babies want to suck milk, there's such a thing as milk. If you find Christianity really seems to fit your heart, then at least it's a bit of evidence that maybe there's some truth behind it. And so I think this gets into the area of evidence, but it doesn't go all the way. It wouldn't be enough for me. So why should you believe a story? But you have to ask yourself the question, why are we story-based creatures, you know? Why is it that we can't make sense of life without a story? It would make sense if we were created by a God that we are the way we are. But anyway, I mean, I don't want to take too much time, because talking about why we believe Christianity is true is just something that it's a very, very big subject, and I would take it very seriously. And I certainly can't just say, oh, here in 30 seconds, here's why Christianity is true.
But you do have a book.
I do have a book called Reason for God, which is actually not about the emotional, psychological, and cultural ways that Christianity makes sense. It's actually completely about the rational and logical reasons why Christianity is true. It's called The Reason for God. Yeah.
That might be very helpful. The question is also about, you mentioned about America putting their hope in God and nation and then the self. And I know you've been in Hong Kong a short time, but you've been to Asia before. I mean, where do you think hope is being placed in?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because there's a sense in which Chinese culture, you might go way back. Now, sir, American culture, if you go back 300 years, you've gone back to the beginning. Evidently, you can't do that in China. So maybe we ought to say that there is some analogy, though, because surely in your Confucian past, though obviously Confucianism is not Christianity, and the Chinese idea of heaven is not the Christian idea of heaven, but it does seem to me that you might say that there was a time in which the idea of heaven and the way Confucius defined heaven and living a life that conformed with heaven, very close to what the Greeks and the Romans called the logos, the kind of rational and moral order behind the universe. So there was a time in Chinese culture in which your hope was that you could conform your life to heaven. And then there was a second stage in Chinese culture, which is a little similar to American second stage. You know, the first stage for American is God, okay, heaven. Second stage was nation. Well, you do have socialism and Marxism. You have this idea that we're going to take this Western philosophy and we're going to understand life completely in light of we're going to create a nation, and we're going to have an approach, a socialism that is really not only good for us but a hope for the world. America is very similar. You know, America always said, you know, we have this democracy that makes us so great, and we're creating this great nation, and we're going to make everybody else as great as we are. A similar kind of confidence that the way in which we were building a nation was the right way for all people. And I do think China went through a period like that. But I have to say, Western consumer capitalism puts so much emphasis on the self, the individual happiness, the fulfillment, the making money. And I can see that in the East it's not as strong as it is in the West, but it's having its influence. So I think there might be actually some rough analogies, and I know nothing. What in the world are they doing in the middle of Hong Kong University? I've never even taken a course on Chinese history. So it's not fair. But I do see some rough analogies behind the very spiritual, the very material, and now the very individual. The spiritual, the kind of collective material, and the individual. And I think, but I also think Angelo Delbanco is right. You would probably find that a fascinating book. He said, I don't think you can have a coherent, cohesive society when everybody's basically saying, I'm going to get mine, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, I mean, Hong Kong is a big mixture of different...
That's why it's so endlessly fascinating.
It's very difficult.
It really is.
But if we have this kind of pursuit of wealth as one, the sort of the individual, and if we have Buddhism is also very strong, Confucianism, and of course being in China also, the influence of China. I mean, where do you think this will lead in this sort of hodgepodge of beliefs in terms of hope and culture?
I don't know, because in the past societies usually had a coherent answer. All the cultural institutions, this is something that Charles Taylor in A Secular Age has said, it used to be that most societies were cohesive. All the cultural institutions of a society agreed on what the answer was, and this is who we are. And today, the cultural institutions do not have coherent answers to that question. And the individuals you're right in saying you've got several very vibrant answers to the question of what is our hope in life, that are all very vibrant. They're all trying to get converts. They're living options for you in Hong Kong. And there's not one that's so dominant that everybody knows that's the right one, as in the past. I don't know what kind of world we're going to have, because in the past, cultures made those decisions for individuals. And they said, here's who we are. And now we're leaving it up to you. And I don't know, it's very confusing. It's a particularly hard part. Even in the 40 years, I'm in my 60s now, I even see with my own children, it's a considerably more difficult world to decide how to live than it was even when I came up just 40 years ago.
You also did quite in a way, a devastating analysis of the human condition. And of course, many of us recognize ourselves in some of the things that you mentioned.
Yes, people got very quiet.
Yeah. And so I think there would be questions about, well then, the things that I do, these earthly things, the earthly desires that I seek and the good works that I do and so on, I mean, do they count then for nothing? I mean, is it also actually hopeless in one sense, right? Meaningless?
That's a good question. No. John Coltrane, who was I know, what has he got to do with anything, right? So, where's he going with this one? John Coltrane was a African-American saxophonist, jazz saxophonist, a tremendous man. And he had a spiritual experience of the reality of God somewhere near the end of his life. And after that, he put together a piece called A Love Supreme, which is a very, very famous jazz album. And if you read the liner notes of the album, what he said was that before he knew there was a God, before he experienced God and the love of God, all of his work was basically about himself. He was trying to get satisfaction out of his work. He was trying to get a sense of being an important person out of his work. He wanted to be successful. He wanted to see people saying, you're the best saxophonist in the world. And he needed that. He wanted that. So ironically, when he was trying to find satisfaction in his work, his deepest longings he was trying to find in his work, he said the work was not really about the work or about the people. It was about himself. When he came to understand that there was a God, and he experienced God's love, he says, now the work was a way of serving people and just making people happy. It was not about me anymore. So it doesn't mean that if you find your hope in God, that suddenly these things don't matter, but it does mean that they don't drive you anymore. They don't distort your life anymore. You're not going to sell your soul in order to get them anymore. And when you do get them, they become ways of serving the human community rather than just ways of serving yourself. Very important.
You seem to be suggesting also that hope is really only available for a Christian. So what if you're not a Christian? I mean, can you have hope? I mean, because we still need hope to live.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult dilemma then you put people in.
I would actually, no, actually, I would say that Christianity offers the most functional hope. And again, at this point, I'm speaking at the level of relevance, not of truth. If Christianity is true and that Jesus is the Son of God, the unique Son of God, well, that now it's not a question. You should believe in Christianity not because it gives you more hope or less hope, but because it's true. But I'm not talking about that at this moment. What I am saying is, if you're simply asking about how hope functions in your life, I would say that there's more dysfunctional hopes and there's more eufunctional hopes. I would say Christianity gives you the most functional hope. It keeps you from being too concerned about this world and too unconcerned. I was hinting at that when I said it's worldly enough because of its emphasis on the bodily resurrection, that this world matters, that you would care about human rights. At the same time, it keeps you from getting all of your hope out of this life. So I think it's the best hope. But frankly, there are other forms of hope that help you live for something beyond your selfishness. And I'll give you one quick example of this. Viktor Frankl, who was a Jewish psychologist, psychiatrist, who was put in the death camps during World War II, and he survived. One of the things he noticed when he was in the death camps was that some people lost hope and they just curled up and died, or in some cases became evil and collaborated with the enemy, and other people stayed brave and kept their hope. And he couldn't figure out why. So afterwards he wrote some books. His most famous book is Man's Search for Meaning. And in it he decided that if your hope was something strictly in this world, then the death camp could take it from you. So if you were basically, your meaning in life or your hope was in your money or your status or even your family, the death camp took it away from you. You had no status, you had no money. Very often some of your family members were killed. And so if your hope was if you found it in this world, you could not handle most kinds of suffering. But he said, for example, there were people who stayed brave, and usually it had to do with some kind of meaning or spiritual reality beyond this life. So he talked about one man, I don't know whether he was a believer or not in God, they were Jewish, of course, who said he believed his wife was in heaven, so he believed in an afterlife, and that the reason he was staying strong and brave was, first of all, he thought she was looking down at him, and he didn't want to disappoint her. And it really gave her meaning in life, him meaning in life and bravery. Now that's not a Christian hope. I mean, by comparison, it's a rather thin hope compared to the resurrection of the triune God and all this stuff that I just gave you. But it was very functional. But again, it was something beyond this world. He had to have some belief that there was an afterlife, or there was some meaning in life beyond this world, because if it's all in this world, then this world can take it away from you and you can be without hope. So I wouldn't say that only Christians can live with hope.
You mentioned the death camps, and in a way the 20th century and 21st century, despair has been more prominent than hope in the way people think about life. And I think it's something that people are still facing today, and there are many questions about this. Because what do you say to a person who is in despair, where life seems to be hopeless? How do you catch any glimpse of hope when you don't see any hope in a very dark world, if you're in that position? And there's another question about, well, then how does Jesus Christ really help you in that kind of situation when there is so much meaninglessness and despair?
Oh, well, the first part of the question I understand. I would say, if Augustine is right, that we're not made so much for peacefulness and tranquility because we've detached from everything, but we're made for love, which I think is more radically human than just trying to detach your heart, harden your heart, as it were. And also, by the way, I think when you love people here on earth, you know you're going to lose people, or people get. One of the best ways to have your heart broken is to love somebody, because if anything goes wrong with them, if they get sick, or if they get hurt, or if they die, or even if they get angry at you. This is the reason why, on the surface, the idea of detachment looks good, but frankly, it does hurt your humanity. I think the most human thing, the most authentic way to be human, is to love and then take the grief and the wisdom that comes from the sadness of loving people. But I actually think that if you just become part of a loving community, even if you don't believe in God, you're actually getting a little bit of the grace of God in your life, even if you don't believe. Because, as I said, my understanding as a Christian is that because God is a Trinity, it means that friendship and relationship and love is what life is about, not power. When you come into a loving relationship with anybody or a loving community, even if you don't believe in God, you actually are getting, you might say, the outskirts of His grace. You are experiencing something, life feels better. And so I think that even being in a loving community can get you out of despair. But the idea of, the ultimate love is to give Jesus said this. He says the ultimate experience of love is to see somebody sacrifice for you. When you see someone losing things in order to love you, then you really feel loved. It's amazing. It's very, very, very... When you see someone saying, I'm going to put my happiness in your happiness, that is, I'm only going to be happy if you're happy, there's something that just builds you up with that. And Jesus, of course, is not a savior the way the other religious founders are saying. He's not just a teacher, he's not just a sage, he's not just a loving person. He actually dies for us. So if you believe that he died for you, then that's the most radically affirming thing, that the Son of God would do that for you. And it's more radically affirming and hope-giving than even just a human community.
Right. I mean, in a way, there are also questions about, say, other religions and hope. I mean, is there anything we can learn from other religions on hope and
Well, you notice I was bending over backwards. I've always liked Buddhism. When I was a college student, like an awful lot of other college students, I read Buddhism, and at the same time I was considering Christianity, trying to figure out where I was going. I think Buddhism recognizes that pride and self-centeredness is a huge problem. There's obviously, Augustine and Buddha are ultimately saying the self-centeredness of our self-centeredness has different roots, and the solution is different roots. But they both agree that self-centeredness and materialism and greed and the desire to acquire is a dead end, and that's extremely helpful. And I also think the idea that basically through spiritual means, spiritual conversion, coming into contact with God through meditation and prayer is also, we agree. So I was bending over backwards to be as, to show all the ways in which Buddhism, in some ways, tracks more with Christianity than Islam, for example, on the human condition, without a doubt. But ultimately, it parts its ways, and I try to explain the reasons why I think Christianity gives you a more, in the end, satisfying set of resources for this.
It's the question about, I guess, what this it that you mentioned actually is, because, what do you think a human person is really yearning for, regardless of their religious beliefs?
Well, the famous, I talked about the fact that we're looking for love, we're looking for a sense of significance and achievement, that my life matters, we're looking for a certain beauty. So we have lots of ways of describing it. Of course, the very famous passage, which in St. Augustine's Confession, probably puts the ultimate Christian answer to the question in the classic way. This is from the Confessions, Book 10. He says, he's talking to God now, this is a prayer. He says, "But what do I love when I love thee?" He says, "Not beauty of bodies, nor the fair harmony of time, nor the brightness of the light, so gladsome to our eyes, nor sweet melodies of varied songs, nor the fragrant smells of flowers, not limbs acceptable to the embracements of the flesh. None of these I love when I love my God, and yet I love a kind of light and melody and fragrance, a kind of meat and embracing. When I love God, there shineth unto my soul what space cannot contain, there soundeth what time beareth not away, There smells what breathing disperses not. There tastes what eating diminishes not. And there clings what satiation divorces not. This is that which I love when I love my God. Sorry for the archaic English, those of you who are working in English as a second language. But what Augustine is trying to say is that the desire for achievement, a desire for feeling significant, the desire for love, all these things ultimately are, you might say, watercourses that come from God himself. That the love of God actually satisfies all of those things, but generally the it is the way we actually psychologically experience it is not just one thing. It's I want to feel useful in life. I want to be loved. I enjoy beauty. I enjoy pleasure. There's a lot of things, and all of it seems to give us that ultimate desire, and it doesn't quite. So all the streams come from God, but ultimately there's more than one way to describe it.
Yeah.
I thought just calling it was a pretty smart idea of C.S. Lewis. Just, in other words, not the indefinable, inconsolable it. Got it? It? Okay.
But if we have this it here, and also some idea out there of hope, somebody's asking, isn't life, in one sense, can be played like a game, and it's a matter of just playing it well, regardless of the outcome after. You can be agnostic about what happens afterwards. Is that a good way of thinking about hope and think about how to live?
How to play the game, you mean?
Yeah, life is a game, so just play it well. You might believe in whatever afterwards, but...
Now, if you ask this question and you're over the age of 35, then please forgive me, but it sounds like a young person's way of talking. I pulled the age card in the beginning. I'm old, and I've seen life, and you're young, and you don't know, so you can't question me. I'm just telling you the truth. I've gone to where you have not gone yet, so I'm coming back and telling you. Life is bad and hard, and you think it's a bowl of cherries, and it's not. So, that's I used to hate it when old people did that to me. I used to utterly hate it. But I really don't think that just feeling like I'm savvy, I'm diligent, I'm playing the game. Listen, no matter how smart you are and how much you think you are playing the game of life well, relational betrayals, serious illnesses, financial reverses. There are many things that will come into your life. They're like mini death camps. And you can't stop them. It doesn't matter how much money you've got. It doesn't matter how many handlers you've got. It doesn't matter how smart you are. Stuff will come into your life that are like death camps that will take away things that you are feeling is your hope and meaning in life. And if it's things, just earthly things, you will be hurt. And I'm sorry, it doesn't matter how well you do the game.
Oh, okay.
Kind of a parental scold there, wasn't it?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I'll get over it.
Yeah, I should stop laughing. Maybe we're coming to the end of our time, but maybe a good thing, a question to ask would be, if you were just speaking to students with all this potential future that they have, and students that are here in Hong Kong, in a leading university, and that they could become future leaders, what would you say to them now in terms of hope and how to live their life and how to begin thinking about their future? Because you've been talking about this quite a bit. But
well, I do think, yes. Thank you for giving me this chance to say. I do think that you're going to be the great danger is for you to be too pragmatic, to say I don't have to think about the bigger questions. I don't want to think about meaning in life or hope. I don't want to look at I don't want to look at Buddhism and Christianity. I don't want to look at the world religions. I don't want to think about the big things. I just need to survive, and the way to do that, I got to get good grades. I got to get into the schools I want. It's dog eat dog out there. It's very competitive, and you spend all of your time thinking, like the last person's question, that if I just play the game really, really well, I'll basically be happy. I know I may need some therapy along the way. I may need a little bit of meditation techniques, but if I just am successful and play the game well, I'll be all right. And I think no. And this is a good place to explore the big questions. Don't be afraid of philosophy classes. Don't be afraid of world religions. Don't be afraid of thinking about the big questions now. It actually gets harder later. Even if you only get the tools, you figure out what books you ought to read. I have to say, I got out of undergraduate school having read about 10% of the books I should have read, but knowing what the other books were that I should be reading, and I spent the next couple of decades doing that. So I be oriented to the big questions here. Just don't let yourself think if I'm just practical, and you know, I do think that the Chinese, if the Americans have their own, you might say, foibles and flaws, I think the Chinese very often think that hard work somehow is the universal solvent. That if I just work unbelievably hard, I will not only will have good self-esteem because I'll know that I'm a hard-working person, but somehow everything is going to be okay if I just work as hard as I possibly can. And no, you need to think too, not just work.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you so much for spending time with us and for your wonderful answers to these difficult questions and for sharing with us about hope. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Timothy Keller.